there was a lot of questions. I found that there was a lot of people who weren't here for prior conferences, and some people I spoke to didn't realize maybe how to access information from past conferences, and I feel bad. It could be that our website is not organized really well, but I just want... Did I write com instead of word? Of course. I only go to the website like 10 times a day. But you know how you don't know your own phone number? It's the same time. Okay, so on the left-hand column here, let me put this more down. You go to PPA conferences, and then 2011 conference, and then conference presentations. So it's kind of buried all in there. But then you have all these wonderful presentations from Dr. Lehmanhorn, Dr. Siegel, Dr. Griggs, etc., etc. And I also have one where I talk about the basic kind of like management of hypokalemic periodic paralysis, and there are a lot of neat tips there. And it's taken from a paper that I published on that. So that's not going to be a main focus of the talks in this conference, but that information is there, so I didn't want to do repetition because I figured we should just address new things. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to discuss today is the differential diagnosis and important diagnostic tests in periodic paralysis. And there are kind of a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this. The first is that there's a whole bunch of you, of us, who come to the conference each year, or every couple of years, and we don't have necessarily, some of us don't have a definitive diagnosis. And it's unclear, maybe some of us don't really have periodic paralysis and we have some other really rare thing that no one knows what it is. Something that most of us, we're smart enough to realize that, there are some aspects of what's going on with us that have a flavor of periodic paralysis, but don't fit the exact definition of classically what maybe periodic paralysis is. And so in that case, you want to make sure that you've done every single possible test that you can to rule in or rule out the diagnosis. And then the second is, for physicians and also for us, the physician will present to a physician and say, I get weak sometimes. What's the physician supposed to do with that? So, they have to start with some kind of decision tree and have to ask certain questions. Well, is the weakness associated with a potassium issue? Does it get better or worse with potassium? Is the blood high or low with potassium? They might ask, is there stiffness ever associated with the weakness? Or is there stiffness first and weakness after, or vice versa? And so it starts to become just a little confusing. So I don't intend to really clarify any major thing. I'm just kind of laying out how one might think about this in terms of the different disorders and what tests you might do. Now, I am supposed to end at 9:50. So I'm going to try to end at 9:45. Someone flag me around 9:40 to tell me where I am, to see how badly I need to rush. Okay, so people can present in a variety of different ways. And so I just kind of laid it out. If you present with episodic weakness, and that's like the most common complaint, you first have to say, well, is it related to potassium? And if so, hypokalemia or hyperkalemia? And then, is it unrelated to potassium? Which, by the way, happens with some of us. So how do we organize our thoughts? Well, first of all, if it is periodic paralysis, what type is it? Because that's even confusing. We say, okay, fine, you have periodic paralysis, but now is it hyper, is it hypo, is it normal, and what do you do with that? And if it's not periodic paralysis, well, then what is it? So, in terms of periodic paralysis, the types of periodic paralysis that have episodic weakness related to potassium, it's functionally a list of all of them. So there's familial hypokalemic, thyrotoxic, Anderson-Tawil, and normal kalemic. And I put normal kalemic. Normal kalemic is a little tricky because some people with a normal potassium level, if you give them potassium, they feel better. And some people with a normal potassium level, if you give them potassium, they get worse. So it's unclear kind of where this fits in, and Dr. Lehmanhorn is probably clarifying this a bit better as we speak. And with hyperkalemic, you have familial as well. It can occur with paramyotonia congenita. It can also be with Anderson-Tawil. So the poor regular country doc is already at kind of a disadvantage here. If it's not periodic paralysis, but you get episodic weakness related to episodic hypokalemia, now the honest truth is that probably it's going to be none of these, because all of these are super rare. I don't know how rare relative to periodic paralysis, but probably at least as rare. But you can have a whole list of kidney disorders, for which you can test most of them. A whole list of endocrinological disorders. You can test for those with blood tests and things. There are ingested substances. Some people, I guess like mainly with anorexia or weight problems, they may do diuretic abuse. Barium poisoning, there's barium in some well waters in some areas of the world. Licorice has this glycerinic acid, which causes potassium wasting. Surreptitious glue sniffing, there's some weird things, but they're real unlikely. And then physiologic, you'd hope that the patient would report or the doctor would see excessive sweating, vomiting, and diarrhea. If you have episodic weakness related to episodic hyperkalemia, you could think about a handful of things, something called renal tubular acidosis type 4, hypoaldosteronism, and again, potassium-sparing diuretic abuse. If it's episodic weakness unrelated to potassium, well then there's a bunch of neurologic conditions, and this is where I fall down because, no pun intended, because I'm a dermatologist and not a neurologist, and so, but myotonia congenita isn't necessarily related to potassium, but of course we have someone in the room where it is related to potassium. Myasthenia gravis, sleep paralysis, narcolepsy, epilepsy, and episodic ataxia. And the reason I mention these things is there are, through the years, I've heard anecdotes where people thought they had, paralysis for a long time, and then it worked genetic testing or it really was ataxia. And vice versa, some people are labeled as having episodic ataxia. Genetic testing can clarify that for us. Now, if you have a fixed periodic paralysis, again, all of the periodic present with weakness. Really conferences I haven't encountered a thyrotoxic periodic paralysis patient. So I don't know. Did you guys, Frank or James or Mickey, if there's fixed weakness associated with thyrotoxic? So I put the question mark there, not to their knowledge. If you don't have periodic paralysis, but you have permanent weakness, there are these congenital myasthenic sonic stiffness, hyper with paramyotonia congenita, the same, and very rarely hypokalemic periodic paralysis, usually if it's a sodium channel, and a lot of, many experts may still, controversially say that they don't believe that stiffness occurs in hypokalemic periodic paralysis. So who you really think have hypo and you get stiffness, you'd beg to differ with an expert who says otherwise. So there's no absolutes here, and I tend to keep an open mind with these things, and I think over the years the experts are keeping an open mind too, I hope. And the Anderson-Tawil can have episodic stiffness. Now, if you don't have periodic paralysis, but you have episodic stiffness, there are other ion channelopathies that are related to periodic paralysis that can do it. And then there are other neurologic disorders that have nothing to do with periodic paralysis, but again, episodic stiffness. So there are some important diagnostic tests. Just a little dry mouth here. The Florida climate somehow makes me sweat more here or something. Okay, so I'm going to discuss one by one all of these tests, so I'm not going to address them right now. There are some other ancillary tests that you can do aside from like the basic ones. One is an EEG to rule out seizure activity. One is a urinalysis. You can do a spot urine, you just pee in a cup once, or collect it for 24 hours. Total pain in the neck to do, but you can do it. And you can measure for potassium, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and pH, and that will sort out some of the renal or endocrine disorders. You can do a urine diuretic screen and a stool magnesium for laxative abuse, because magnesium makes you go. So yeah, anyway. Then there's endocrine and renal tests, aldosterone, renin. So it's a hormonal test basically that you do from the blood. And then there are genetic tests. You can genetically test for Barter's, Gittleman's, some renal tubular acidosis, and Little syndrome. Myasthenia gravis is often diagnosed with a blood test. Narcolepsy, you do a sleep study, and you can do a spinal tap looking for some hormone. Stiff person syndrome, there's also antibodies in the blood that you would see. And myotonic dystrophy, there is gene tests that you can do. Electrolytes, the most important test, I think. You measure potassium during an attack. Is it low? Usually you're dealing with hypokalemic periodic paralysis. If it's high, you're dealing with hyper-PP. If it's normal, it leaves us guessing. And many times we're left guessing, right? That's the pitfalls, and Don Anderson had mentioned this earlier or yesterday. If there are different potassium might elevate falsely, which will screw up the hypo if you're in an attack and then leave the tourniquet on too long, which elevates potassium, or you have hemolysis where the blood cells break, the potassium will go high. So if you're 3 and in an attack, and you have this slight deviation, and now you're 3.6, they're going to be like, well, potassium's normal. And that throws them into a whole different differential diagnosis than what we were talking about. If the sodium is always low or always high, you have to suspect some adrenal gland dysfunction, either too much aldosterone or too little aldosterone. Genetic testing, the gold standard. If you have a positive genetic test, that kind of ends the debate, I think. Is that fair to say? I think that's fair to say. A negative test, though, does not rule it out. So there are 30% or even more people out there who have a flavor of some symptoms of periodic paralysis. They get a negative test, and that doesn't tell us anything. It just means that maybe your gene is not discovered yet. Okay. And there are a whole bunch of genes that the sodium channel gene mutation is associated with a variety of periodic paralysis. Calcium channel gene is with hypo, etc., etc. So there's there's sodium, calcium, potassium, and chloride channel genes, and then when they're mutated, you can get these different diseases. There is this test called the long exercise test that was developed by a neurologist, Dr. McManus, who published it. And basically what you do is you record, you put electrodes in the muscle, and you do some kind of exercise, and then you wait, and you record certain electrical activity, and there's a certain readout that's consistent with periodic paralysis, like 70% of the time. Again, positive test, very helpful. Negative test, you still may have it, so you have to move on to some other diagnostic thing. And so a negative test, the readout would be a line like this. A positive, you'd see this decrement. They call it some decrease in the voltage readout over time. And they call it the long exercise test because it takes a long time. It's not that you're exercising for a long time. It's just the test is like an hour. Okay. Then you can do a muscle biopsy. And the question is, what muscle do you do it from and when? So, and this is absolutely not my area of expertise, but just from speaking with people, you can identify the worst area affected, often in the thighs, by MRI, and you go after that. Okay, so that's basically when you do it, whether you do it in an attack or outside of an attack. I don't know that it's that important, although some people say that if you wait a couple of days after the attack, it may be most sensitive. It's not specific. There are other diseases that you can see vacuoles in the muscle from a myopathy, and that includes some diseases that are pretty rare. So myocardial myopathy, Danon disease, X-linked myopathy, and inclusion body myositis. But I think it's fair to say that clinically you can probably rule these out, in which case when you have vacuoles on the muscle biopsy, it starts to become reasonably telling that there may be a problem there. But it differs the type of PP. Hypo, hyper, PMC, ATS, they'll all look the same on the biopsy. And a normal biopsy doesn't rule out the disease. What if you just got the wrong spot? So this, they prep you, they put the thing in, hopefully with anesthesia, another big problem, right? But, okay. And you'll see vacuoles on the muscle biopsy, and you can see vacuolar myopathy independent of attacks. Maybe you had one attack in your life, you can still end up with vacuoles on the biopsy. Permanent muscle weakness will show conversion of myocytes to fibrosis and fat. So there is this distinction that, and Deb Grant, who's going to be speaking later from the Periodic Paralysis International, she brought this out. You know, there's abortive attacks where you have weakness that can last for a long time, and then there's permanent muscle weakness. And the difference is abortive attacks with the right medication, maybe you'll get some strength back. Permanent muscle weakness, if there's scar in the muscle, it's permanent, hence it's permanent. So there is a distinction there. And this is a kind of vacuole you might see. And on electromyogram, this is a big vacuole you can see. Then there's MRI. You can do MRI. You know, I don't know if every person needs to do MRI, but the whole point is if it's not a clear-cut case of things, or you're curious how much muscle loss you have, it's something that you can consider doing. And it quantifies the fibrofatty degeneration of the permanent muscle weakness. And then there's a sodium MRI, which does a little better job of quantitating not only the fibrofatty degeneration, but also how much swelling is in the muscle. So that if you have a lot of swelling in the muscle that's potentially reversible, you can kind of see how chronically affected you are. And this is an example, this is just a slide taken from Dr. Lehmanhorn's talk in 2011. And basically here's a lot of white is a lot of sodium, and here white is a lot of sodium, and normal is not so much sodium. And so you can see a normal patient and an affected patient. Then Dr. Weber. So question, this white outline here, is that like not fat and this is supposed to be fat? Yeah. Yes? So there is fatty degeneration all around the muscle here, so that's okay. You can do a CT scan without contrast, and that may show some fatty replacement of muscle, but it's not as good as MRI. And this is the kind of thing you'd see, the same kind of deal. Normal and abnormal, more fat here, less muscle. You can do exercise challenge tests. I'm not going to get into the specifics of these. I would say that I picked this picture in specifics because doing it on a bike, if you have a paralysis attack while the treadmill is moving and you can't like stop, you collapse and there's a big accident. If you get paralyzed on a bike, it's way safer. So if you're going to do an exercise challenge test, my recommendation would be on a bicycle. And the idea is that you'd exercise maybe without pre-medication, and if you know that you can reliably induce an attack that way in the doctor's office, and then they can measure for diagnostic purposes, that's something to do. You can do a cold challenge test, usually for hyper and paramyotonia congenita, and there you'd submerge forearms into cold water and do an EMG on the cold stiff muscle, or measure potassium during an attack. You can do a fasting challenge, and neat that this guy is hungry and he wants pizza and carbohydrate and salty things. Because you type in hunger into Google and you got to get a picture for that. Anyway, so this test for hyper and paramyotonia congenita and potassium aggravated myotonia. So all things that get worse with potassium administration but get better with carbohydrate. Again, there's no evidence-based protocols, but basically you fast and then you end up inducing an attack with light exercise. You do potassium challenge test. I like the fasting because it's physiologic. If we all kind of fast sometimes when we can't get enough to eat. Potassium challenge is very dangerous. You're administering potassium that's not natural. You can't get that much potassium in your diet to trigger, and it can cause fatal arrhythmia. So it's an unnatural way to make a test. I guess there are going to be situations where people are desperate and they have to do it, but it's kind of strongly discouraged, and certainly only done in the hospital environment. There's a glucose insulin challenge test. This also, if you just do glucose alone, it's physiologic, and you eat carbohydrates, your body makes its own insulin, drives potassium to cells, and you should get an attack if you're hypo. If you want to add insulin to boot, that becomes dangerous because you can get very dangerous low blood sugar, and it should be done in the hospital. I mean, these all things really should be done in the hospital if you're going to induce attacks. You can do a routine electromyography, EMG, and you may see certain readings in myotonia, and Dr. Cleland will address that later. For electrocardiograms, there's these blips that have letters to them, and so there's a Q blip over here and a T blip over here, and the distance should be a certain short distance. And if it's long, then you have long QT, and that's an Anderson. You can measure CK, thyroid tests. So I wrap up with proposed diagnostic criteria for hypo. Classically, low serum K during an attack, on more than a single occasion, preceded by a trigger. And the strength should return with potassium intake and normalized potassium. And then, or you could have a genetic test. For hyper, same deal, weakness with high K, return of strength with normalized potassium. And then, or positive genetic test. And for ATS, periodic paralysis, cardiac arrhythmia, family member, or a genetic test. Maybe it's periodic paralysis. So here's where all these tests may help. If one of those tests that I described, the McManus test, the challenge test, EMG, biopsy, etc. Some of those are positive, maybe you have it, but maybe you don't have the standard diagnosis. And so what do you do if the criteria are not met? Well, entertain another diagnosis is the natural thing. If that ends up not panning out, you know, I'm a big proponent of just empirically treating. I know in dermatology, if there's a rash, and I'm not sure what it is, but I have a feeling it's in a group of disorders, sometimes I just treat, cross my fingers, and it goes away. And by the fact that it gets better, we can make a diagnosis because it responded to treatment. Anyway, that's it. I ran over, I think. Thank you for your attention. So, what are we doing now? Questions or straight to James? Okay, questions. Question in the back.
You mentioned about the low sodium with the low potassium and possibly being due to too much aldosterone.
Uh-huh.
And I just wanted to know if you could, because I also have the low sodium with the low potassium, and I seem to be doing much better once we got the aldosterone under control.
Interesting. So again, my endocrinology is pretty soft. If you have aldosterone, you'll either have low potassium and high sodium. That's if your aldosterone's high. And if your aldosterone's low, you'll have high potassium and low sodium. So the fact that you have low this and low that is a little funky. I'm not sure what to make of that. Sorry.
You mentioned the long QT with Anderson-Twill. The long QT with Anderson-Twill, is that only, I only heard you mention it with Anderson-Twill.
Correct. So if you have periodic paralysis and long QT, then you're most likely to have Anderson-Twill syndrome. Normal people, or people with just plain, straight up hyper or hypoperiodic paralysis, should have a normal, QT interval.
I have a question about QT as well. I'm back here.
Oh, okay.
Will QT always be recognized as abnormal, or would the person interpreting the results need to be told to look for a long QT?
You have to look for that. Long QT, my understanding is that it can happen while you're in an attack. It can it can just be there whether you're in an attack or out of an attack. So, it can happen only when the potassium is too low or too high, depending on what your periodic paralysis is. So they have to look for it, basically, and they have to look for it in different settings.
But would it always be reported as abnormal? Is it an abnormal thing to happen, or is it only abnormal, like is it only something to look for?
It's only abnormal if they catch it, but hold on one second.
Yeah, so it's actually not just the QT interval that's important. There's actually a prominent, and this is a specific for ATS, there's a prominent U wave that follows the T wave, and I can actually show you that on one of my cases. So it's not just the QT interval that is what we look at. It's this characteristic configuration of the T wave and then the U wave that follows it.
I guess my question is if somebody was looking at the EKG or the Holter monitor and they saw that, would that always trigger a report of abnormality?
Yeah, if they knew, I guess it's a question of if you knew what you were looking for, it could be quite subtle, and a person who's just screening a Holter monitor and a person who has arrhythmia for collapses, query cause, may not notice it unless they're told, we think this person might have Anderson-Twill syndrome, and they would know exactly what to look for. But just looking at an ECG, you could miss that.
Mine's on the same topic too. Would a normal person, though, who doesn't have hypo, because I tend to be hypo, would a normal person that has low potassium also have a longer QT wave, or is it only with hypo?
Yeah, thanks for adding the microphone on that one. Yes, a person with very low potassium will get ECG changes. Now, I'm not a cardiologist, so I can't quite remember whether the QT gets shorter or longer in that situation, but in very severe hypokalemia, you do see ECG changes, but they will reverse when the potassium is brought back to normal, whereas the person with ATS will always have those ECG changes. Does that make sense?
So regarding long QT, I feel that it's very important for people to be examining full exomes. For instance, there's the nitric oxide synthase gene, so there are SNPs there that create short QT. So if a person has Anderson's will and these other SNPs that create short QT, then that person will not have long QT. They will have some intermediate form of QT. So just looking at a few genes at a time is going to cause some trouble because many other SNPs affect the QT interval.
Right. So yeah, obviously, we're hoping that genetic testing gets more robust as we go forward, and hopefully we can make some kind of gene chip that tests all the genes for QT and all the genes for periodic paralysis all in one shot, so that we're more robust in that analysis.
Basically, an exome analysis.
Great. Well, question. Well, we'll go in the blue for. Okay.
Sorry. I noticed up on your charts that you had different blood testing for different ions, and one of the ones you listed was phosphorus. All of my ions, my potassium is fine. I get hypophosphatemia and become paralyzed. But you didn't list any diseases that are associated with hypophosphatemia.
So, yeah, so hypophosphatemia, again, is a kind of endocrine issue. There are definitely people who report issues with phosphorus and report getting better with phosphorus. Is the webinar good? Okay. So, yeah, it's just completely out of my area of expertise, and also I don't know what kind of evidence-based. Do you guys have any comments about phosphorus? I mean, because I know Dr. Lehmanhorn was, mentioning, Alan, we were talking that people drinking Diet Coke, maybe the phosphorus in the Diet Coke was helping them, and that was really a medicine, and not just because it didn't have sugar or something. But I guess that's something that we need to look into when we get proper populations to study this in a good way.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's well placed here, my question, but I'm very interested in treatment monitoring. So do you think MR scan will be a good monitoring tool for the efficacy of treatment of hypokalemic disease without any attacks, to see only the muscle weakness changes?
I'm going to yield that to Frank.
Yeah, surely on the long run. Because in hypokalemic, on the long run, you might develop this replacement muscle degeneration, and therefore muscle MRI would be a good monitoring thing. The great advantage of muscle MRI is that you see a large amount of muscle. If you do EEG or something like that, you only see a very small region of the muscle. And in muscle MRI, you can have a good overview of the whole thigh, of the whole calf, and so on. So you could have a good monitoring issue to see the replacement of normal muscle structure by muscle degeneration. And the monitoring of ongoing muscular degeneration can be very well done by ordinary muscle MRI. You do not need 23 sodium muscle MRI for that reason.
Thank you. The webinar folks are saying that our questions are mumbled. I hope at least the answers are okay. I don't know. We'll keep going though.
I have a question about permanent muscle weakness. For years I need a lot of sodium, but from my age 6 till 2 years ago. And now my muscles hurt when I take sodium, so I'm on 1.2. Is it the start of permanent muscle weakness? Before I need it, now I can take it.
I'm not sure. Before you needed sodium that helped your strength.
Yeah.
Now sodium makes your strength worse.
Yeah.
And is that a sign of permanent muscle weakness? I'm not sure. Again, I'm going to yield to these guys. If
I have no explanation for that at the moment. Usually should avoid sodium in hypopathy, of course. And muscle degeneration in hypopathy is correlated with too much sodium in the muscle. So if you have too much sodium, your muscle is prone to degenerate, and sodium and low sodium diet usually should help, not vice versa.
Yeah. Before I tried to do a low sodium diet, but it makes me worse, and since 2 years it changed. My son needs about 20 grams sodium every day, and advice not to ignore. And if he doesn't do it, he is paralyzed in bed.
I think it's. I think this is maybe a unique case. This is one of those things where you hope that someone else in the room after will come and say, "Hey, that happens to me," and then you get something going. I mean, that's part of what we do here. Apparently, my microphone they can hear, but that microphone they can't hear. So I wonder if maybe we just run around, right?
Or just repeat the question.
Or just repeat the question. We can do that too.
Well, we even have a hard time understanding here.
Yeah.
You have to hold it closer.
Oh, okay. Hold the microphone close to your mouth.
I guess we should also identify ourselves for the webinar people. This is Mickey Siegel. The issue of sodium, needing sodium and sodium being damaging is one that we've started to look at also in the case of people who have this ADHD-like disorder that looks a lot like hypokalemia, periodic paralysis. And one thing we found is in some of the families, some of the people seem to have a second gene that makes a difference. So you can have some people who are very symptomatic, and then you have some other people who you think have the gene because they have to get it from one of the parents, and have other things going on, like when they exercise, they lose a huge amount of salt that's just caked on their skin, and you can have weakness just from low sodium. I think that can happen to just anybody if you're out in the sun and exercising for hours. And that can be protective against the other type. And so if you have a gene for losing too much sodium, and you also have a periodic paralysis gene, that combination can be a problem. We used to think that it was really unusual to say that we wanted to explain what was going on in anybody by saying there's two genes involved. But the more we've been looking at people's whole genomes, we've been finding stuff like this all over the place. And so I think what we're going to find, what we're finding with the ADHD situation is that, yes, there's a primary gene and there are several other, likely several other genes, but there's various other genes that modulate what's going on, including ones that cause you to lose too much sodium. And there's a lot of work that's been done on the other end of this, of people who, among black people in the United States, there's more high blood pressure because the people who came over on the slave ships who couldn't hold on to salt tended to die. So selectively, the people who survived hold on to salt better than other people, and therefore more susceptible to high blood pressure. So we're seeing the other end of this, that people often in Northern Europe who weren't, ancestors maybe came from Africa, Middle East, or whatever, and getting rid of salt in warm climates was no problem. Getting rid of, you tend to accumulate much salt, and some of the things like cystic fibrosis may be the advantage of having one select cystic fibrosis gene may be that help you get rid of excess salt. And so there's this complicated interplay between when sodium is too high and when sodium is too low. So some people are going to have to look at more than one gene. And the point was made before about you can't just look at one gene, you're going to have to look at the whole picture.
Thank you, Vicki. So if you have questions and we didn't get to it, please write them down. And if we don't get to your question in the whole conference, ask us after, and also we'll try to email answers to questions that we don't get here.